The gunshot echoed across the valley, startling Grace Keating from her restless sleep. She bolted upright in her small bed, the threadbare quilt falling to her waist as her eyes adjusted to the darkness of her cabin. It was the third night in a row that gunfire had disturbed the usual chorus of crickets and distant coyote calls that typically lulled her to sleep in the small town of Redemption, Arizona Territory, 1885. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped from the bed and padded across the rough wooden floor to the window. The moon hung low and full in the night sky, casting long shadows across the land. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose from the direction of the Jenkins ranch. The sound of hoofbeats approaching her isolated cabin sent a fresh wave of panic through her body. She reached for the rifle her father had left her when he died 2 years prior, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cool metal. "Miss Keating." A deep voice called out, followed by an urgent knock. "Miss Keating, are you in there?" Grace recognized the voice of Sheriff Wilson, and relief washed over her. She unbolted the door and pulled it open to find the aging lawman standing on her porch, his face grim in the lantern light. "Sheriff." "What's happening?" "The Blackwell Gang," he said, removing his hat. "They hit the Jenkins place, burned it to the ground." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Are they?" "They got away, thank the Lord, but word is the gang's headed this way." The sheriff's eyes were somber. "I've arranged for a stagecoach to take you and some of the other women to Tucson tomorrow morning. It's not safe here anymore." Grace gripped the door frame, her mind racing. Her small farm was all she had left of her parents. The drought had taken most of her crops, but she'd been making do, selling eggs and milk in town and occasionally working at the general store. Leaving meant losing everything. "I can't just abandon my home," she protested. "You don't have a choice, Miss Keating, these men." The sheriff trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "They've done terrible things to women in other towns. I won't have that happen here." After the sheriff left, Grace couldn't return to sleep. She moved around her small cabin, gathering the few items she couldn't bear to leave behind: her mother's locket, her father's pocket watch, a small leather-bound journal, and what little money she had saved. She would have to leave her chickens and her cow, Maybelle. The thought brought tears to her eyes. As dawn broke across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Grace loaded her meager belongings into a small trunk. She'd just finished securing it when she heard the distant sound of gunfire again. Panic seized her. The stagecoach wasn't due for hours yet. She rushed to her window and saw a plume of dust in the distance, heading straight for her cabin. It wasn't the sheriff or anyone from town. They would have come from the east. These riders were coming from the north, from the direction of the Jenkins ranch. Grace grabbed her rifle and rushed outside to the small stable where her mare, Penny, was kept. She worked quickly to saddle the horse, her fingers fumbling with the straps as the sound of approaching riders grew louder. She had just led Penny out of the stable when 5 men on horseback crested the hill behind her cabin. The Blackwell Gang. Even from a distance, she recognized their leader, Illy Blackwell, a notorious outlaw whose face adorned wanted posters throughout the territory. Grace swung herself onto Penny's back and dug her heels into the horse's sides, urging her into a gallop. She headed south, toward the vast expanse of desert that stretched between her cabin and the next town. It was a dangerous route, especially in the growing heat of the day, but she had no choice. The sound of pursuing hoofbeats and men's shouts drove her forward. Penny was a strong horse, but she couldn't outrun 5 fresh mounts forever. Grace knew she needed to find somewhere to hide. The desert landscape offered little in the way of shelter, just scrubby brush, cacti, and the occasional rocky outcropping. As Penny began to tire, Grace steered her toward a cluster of large boulders to the east. If she could reach them, perhaps she could find a place to hide until the gang gave up their pursuit. She was halfway to the rocks when Penny stumbled, nearly throwing Grace from the saddle. The horse recovered, but her pace slowed considerably. The gap between Grace and her pursuers narrowed. "There's nowhere to run, little lady," one of the men called out, his voice carrying across the open land. Grace reached the rocks and dismounted quickly, leading Penny into a narrow passage between two towering boulders. The space widened into a small enclosed area, hidden from view. She tied Penny to a scraggly mesquite tree and tried to quiet her own ragged breathing as she listened for the approaching riders. The men's voices grew louder as they reached the rocks. "She went in there," one of them said. "I saw her. Illy wants her alive," another replied. "Remember what happened to Jeb when he shot that schoolteacher in Prescott?" "I ain't forgetting. Split up. She can't have gone far." Grace pressed herself against the cool stone, clutching her rifle. She wasn't much of a shot, but her father had taught her the basics. If they found her, she wouldn't go without a fight. The sound of boots crunching on gravel nearby made her freeze. A shadow fell across the narrow entrance to her hiding place, and a moment later, a man appeared. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a dark beard and cold eyes. One of Blackwell's men. Grace raised her rifle, her finger hovering over the trigger. The man's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed as he reached for his own gun. The crack of a gunshot filled the small space, but it wasn't from Grace's rifle. The outlaw's expression changed from menace to shock as he crumpled to the ground, revealing another figure standing behind him. A tall man with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin stood at the entrance, a smoking revolver in his hand. He wore a dusty black hat, a faded blue shirt, and well-worn leather chaps. His face was partially hidden by several days' worth of stubble, but his eyes were sharp and alert as they scanned the enclosed space and settled on Grace. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Grace shook her head, too stunned to speak. "We need to move," he said, holstering his weapon. "The others will have heard the shot." "Who are you?" Grace finally managed to ask. "Flynn Garrett," he replied, already moving toward her horse. "I've been tracking Blackwell's gang for 3 days now. But explanations can wait. We need to get out of here." Flynn quickly checked Penny's legs, frowning at what he saw. "Your mare's lamed herself. She won't get far." He whistled softly, and a moment later, a large black stallion appeared at the entrance to the hideaway. "We'll take my horse. He can carry us both." Grace hesitated, looking at the dead outlaw and then at the stranger who just saved her life. Could she trust him? She had little choice. Shouts echoed from nearby, and the decision was made for her. Flynn helped her mount his stallion, then swung up behind her. The horse moved out of the rocky enclosure at a steady pace, somehow managing to move quietly despite its size. Instead of heading back the way they'd come, Flynn guided the horse deeper into the maze of rocks and boulders. He seemed to know where he was going, navigating the winding passages with confidence. "Duck down," he whispered in her ear as they passed beneath a low overhang. His arm tightened around her waist, holding her steady as the horse picked its way carefully through the rocky terrain. They emerged from the rocks on the far side, facing an open stretch of desert that shimmered in the midday heat. Flynn didn't hesitate, urging his horse into a gallop across the exposed land. "Where are we going?" Grace called over her shoulder. "I have a camp about 10 miles south of here," Flynn replied. "We can rest there until nightfall, then figure out our next move." They rode hard for nearly an hour, the stallion maintaining a remarkable pace despite carrying 2 riders. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith in the sky, Flynn guided them toward a small canyon that cut into the otherwise flat landscape. His camp was simple, but well chosen: a small fire pit beneath an overhang that provided shade, a bedroll, and some basic supplies. A small spring trickled from the canyon wall nearby, providing fresh water. Flynn helped Grace dismount, then tended to his horse before turning his attention to her. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her legs felt weak and her hands were still trembling from the events of the morning. "Thank you for what you did back there." Flynn nodded, his expression somber. "Blackwell and his men have been terrorizing this territory for months now. I've been after them since they raided a settlement near Tombstone, killed some good people there." "Are you a lawman?" Grace asked, noticing for the first time the silver star pinned to his vest, partially hidden by his jacket. U.S. Marshal, he confirmed. Though I haven't checked in with my superiors in a while, this hunt has become personal. There was something in his tone that made Grace curious, but she didn't press him. They had more immediate concerns. What will happen now? I can't go back to my cabin. No, you can't, Flynn agreed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. Blackwell doesn't give up easily. Once he sets his sights on something or someone, he's relentless. But why would he be after me? I'm nobody. Flynn's expression darkened. Your land. It's directly in the path of the proposed railroad line. Word is, certain interests are paying handsomely for that land by any means necessary. Grace sank down onto a rock, the reality of her situation hitting her full force. So my home is gone. Everything I've worked for. I'm sorry, Flynn said simply. He moved to his saddlebags and pulled out some jerky and a canteen. You should eat something. We've got a long ride ahead of us once night falls. Grace accepted the food and water gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry and thirsty she was. As she ate, she studied Flynn more carefully. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness to his movements, a consideration in the way he spoke to her. He wasn't what she'd expected from a U.S. Marshal hunting down dangerous outlaws. Where will we go? She asked after finishing her sparse meal. There's a town called Silverdale about 2 days' ride from here. I have friends there who can help us. From there, we can send word to the territorial governor about what's happening. And then what? I have no home, no money. Flynn met her gaze. One problem at a time, Miss Keating. First, we get to safety. Then we deal with Blackwell. After that, well, you seem like a resourceful woman. You'll find your way. His confidence in her, a complete stranger, was oddly comforting. Grace found herself studying his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. The small scar that ran along his jawline, the way his eyes seemed to take in everything at once, alert and watchful. They rested through the hottest part of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. As dusk approached, Flynn prepared to move out. He offered Grace his jacket as the desert air began to cool rapidly. Thank you, she said, slipping it on. It was still warm from his body and smelled of leather, horses, and something uniquely male. For everything. I'd likely be dead or worse if you hadn't come along. Flynn nodded, something flickering in his eyes that Grace couldn't quite read. We should get moving. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dawn. They rode through the night, Flynn's arm securely around Grace's waist as they navigated the desert landscape by moonlight. He kept them away from the main trails, following routes that only someone intimately familiar with the territory would know. As they rode, Flynn told her about his life as a marshal, about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about his years tracking outlaws across the Western Territories. Grace found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his unwavering sense of justice, and the occasional glimpses of humor that broke through his serious demeanor. In turn, she told him about her parents, about struggling to keep the farm going after their deaths, about her dreams of someday expanding her small operation into something that could truly sustain her. You're brave, Flynn said after she finished her story. Most women would have sold that land and moved to town after losing their parents. It wasn't bravery, Grace replied. It was stubbornness. That land was everything to my father. I couldn't bear to let it go. Stubbornness is just bravery that won't quit, Flynn said. And Grace could hear the smile in his voice even though she couldn't see his face in the darkness. They made camp again just before dawn in another well-hidden spot that Flynn seemed to know. This time, they were in a small grove of cottonwood trees beside a narrow creek, a rare oasis in the desert landscape. Flynn built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke minimal, and prepared a more substantial meal than they'd had the previous day. As they ate, Grace became aware of a growing tension between them, a heightened awareness that made her pulse quicken whenever their eyes met or their hands accidentally touched. We should reach Silverdale by tomorrow evening, Flynn said, breaking a silence that had stretched between them. "My friend there, Doc Samuelson, has a place where you can stay safely while I deal with the gang." "While you deal with them," Grace repeated, alarm rising within her. "You can't face them alone. There are at least 5 of them." "4 now," Flynn corrected grimly, "and I won't be alone." "The sheriff in Silverdale is a good man. He'll help." "It's still too dangerous," Grace insisted. "These men, they're killers." Flynn's expression hardened. "So am I when I need to be." Something in his tone made Grace shiver despite the warmth of the fire. "What did you mean earlier, when you said this hunt had become personal?" Flynn was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "Blackwell and his men raided a settlement near Tombstone 3 months ago. My sister lived there with her husband and their young son. They killed her husband when he tried to protect their home. My sister." He paused, his jaw tight. "She took her own life 2 weeks later. Their boy is now in an orphanage in Tucson." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Flynn, I'm so sorry." "Blackwell has to be stopped," he said simply. "Not just for my sister and her family, but for all the others he's hurt, for you and your land, for everyone who's suffered because of his greed." Grace moved closer to him, placing her hand on his arm. "I understand wanting justice, but revenge. It can consume you." Flynn looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. The firelight caught in her eyes, turning them to liquid amber. "It's already consuming me," he admitted quietly. "Has been for months now." "Then let me help you," Grace said. "We'll face them together." Flynn shook his head. "I can't put you in danger, not after everything you've been through." "I'm already in danger," she pointed out, "and I'm stronger than I look." A smile tugged at the corner of Flynn's mouth. "I don't doubt that for a minute, Miss Keating." "Grace," she corrected him. "After everything we've been through, I think you can call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart skip a beat. The next day's journey was more difficult. They spotted riders in the distance twice and had to alter their route to avoid being seen. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and the air had taken on the charged quality that preceded a desert storm. "We need to find shelter," Flynn said, eyeing the approaching storm with concern. "These summer storms can be fierce." They were in open country with little in the way of natural shelter. Flynn pushed his stallion harder, heading for a line of cliffs visible in the distance. The wind began to pick up, bringing with it the scent of rain and dust. They reached the cliffs just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Flynn guided them along the base until he found what he was looking for, a shallow cave cut into the rock face. It wasn't deep, but it would provide shelter from the worst of the storm. They dismounted quickly and led the horse inside just as the sky opened up. Rain fell in sheets, turning the desert floor into flowing rivers of mud within minutes. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed immediately by deafening thunder that made both Grace and the horse jump. Flynn placed a reassuring hand on his stallion's neck, murmuring soothing words until the animal calmed. Then he turned to Grace, who stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the storm's fury with wide eyes. "You okay?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Grace nodded, though she flinched as another bolt of lightning split the sky. "I've always been a bit afraid of storms," she admitted. "My mother used to tell me it was just the angels rearranging furniture in heaven, but that never quite made it less frightening." Flynn smiled at that. "My mother said the same thing. I always wondered why the angels were so clumsy." Grace laughed, and the sound seemed to brighten the gloomy cave. Flynn found himself wanting to hear it again. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Flynn set about making their temporary shelter as comfortable as possible, laying out his bedroll and gathering what little dry wood he could find near the cave entrance to build a small fire. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the rain turned to a steady downpour that created a curtain of water at the cave's mouth. Grace sat close to the fire, Flynn's jacket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the flames dance. "We won't make it to Silverdale tonight," Flynn said, sitting down beside her. "No, I suppose not," Grace agreed. She looked at him, her expression suddenly vulnerable in the firelight. "Flynn, I'm afraid." The admission seemed to cost her something, as though she wasn't used to confessing her fears. Flynn reached out and took her hand, his large one engulfing her smaller one. "Fear dies beside me," he said softly. "I won't let anything happen to you, Grace, I promise." Their eyes held and something shifted between them, a recognition, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Grace was the first to look away, but she didn't withdraw her hand from his. "Tell me about your nephew," she said after a moment. "The one in Tucson." Flynn's expression softened at the mention of the boy. "James, he's 5, smart as a whip and fearless, just like his mother was. Once this is all over, I'm going to bring him to live with me. You have a home somewhere?" Grace asked, realizing how little she knew about this man who had saved her life. "A small ranch outside of Prescott," Flynn replied. "Nothing fancy, but there's good grazing land and a solid house. I haven't been there much these past few years with my work as a marshal. But it's time I settled down, especially for James's sake." "He'll be lucky to have you," Grace said sincerely. Flynn's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. "I don't know the first thing about raising a child," he confessed. "Sarah, my sister, she was the one who was good with children. I've spent most of my adult life chasing outlaws and sleeping under the stars." "You'll learn," Grace assured him. "Children don't need perfection. They need love and safety and someone who believes in them." Flynn studied her face in the firelight. "You would have made a good mother," he said softly. Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Perhaps someday," she murmured. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside. Despite the circumstances, Grace found herself enjoying Flynn's company, his dry humor, and the way he listened to her as though everything she said was important. As the fire burned down to embers and the temperature in the cave dropped further, Flynn insisted that Grace take the bedroll while he kept watch. "You need sleep too," Grace protested. "I'm used to going without," Flynn replied. "Marshal's life doesn't exactly lend itself to regular hours." Grace was too exhausted to argue further. She settled onto the bedroll, pulling Flynn's jacket tighter around her. Despite her exhaustion, she found it hard to sleep with him sitting just a few feet away, his profile outlined against the dim glow of the dying fire. "Flynn," she said softly. He turned to look at her. "Yes, thank you. For everything," he nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Get some sleep, Grace." She did sleep eventually, lulled by the steady sound of rain and the comforting presence of the man who had become her protector. When she woke hours later, the storm had passed and dawn was breaking. Flynn was still sitting where she'd last seen him, his eyes alert as he watched the cave entrance. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, sitting up and pushing hair from her face. "A little," he said, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "The storm's passed. We should get moving. We can reach Silverdale by midday if we push hard." They set out as soon as the sun cleared the horizon. The desert had been transformed by the rain. Normally dusty arroyos had become flowing streams, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and desert plants releasing their moisture. As Flynn had predicted, they reached the outskirts of Silverdale just after noon. It was a small but prosperous-looking town, with a main street lined with businesses and homes that showed signs of care and attention. Flynn guided them directly to a small house on the edge of town. A sign in the front yard identified it as Dr. Samuelson's office and residence. An older man with a full white beard and kind eyes answered Flynn's knock. His face broke into a wide smile when he saw who was at his door. "Flynn Garrett, as I live and breathe. It's been too long, son." The two men embraced and Flynn turned to introduce Grace. "Doc, this is Miss Grace Keating. She's in some trouble and I was hoping you might be able to help." The doctor's eyes were shrewd as they assessed Grace, but his smile remained warm. "Any friend of Flynn's is welcome here. Come in, both of you. You look like you could use a hot meal and a proper rest." Inside, the doctor's home was comfortable and cluttered with books and medical instruments. He ushered them into a small dining room and insisted on serving them a meal before hearing their story. His housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Potts, brought out plates of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread that made Grace realize just how hungry she was. As they ate, Flynn explained their situation to Dr. Samuelson, who listened with growing concern. "Blackwell's gang has been a plague on this territory for too long," the doctor said when Flynn finished his account. "And now they're working for the railroad interests. That's a dangerous combination. We need to send word to the territorial governor," Flynn said. "And I need to speak with Sheriff Collins. Is he still in office?" "He is," Dr. Samuelson confirmed, "and he'll be glad to see you. He's been trying to organize a posse to go after Blackwell for weeks now, but most folks are too scared to join up." "They have reason to be," Flynn said grimly. "Blackwell doesn't leave witnesses. You can stay here as long as you need," the doctor told Grace. "Mrs. Potts will make up the spare room for you." "Thank you," Grace said, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger, "but I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Dr. Samuelson said firmly. "Any young woman brave enough to ride across the desert with this reckless marshal is welcome in my home." Flynn smiled at that, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "I need to go speak with the sheriff," he said, rising from the table. "Grace, you'll be safe here with Doc. I'll be back as soon as I can." Grace wanted to protest, to insist on going with him, but she knew it would be futile. Instead, she watched him leave, a sense of unease settling over her at their separation. Dr. Samuelson seemed to sense her concern. "Flynn can take care of himself," he assured her. "I've known him for 15 years now, ever since he brought in his first outlaw as a young deputy. He's the best lawman I've ever encountered." "It's not just that," Grace admitted. "I'm worried about what happens after Blackwell is caught. My home is gone, everything I've worked for." The doctor patted her hand. "One day at a time, my dear. For now, let's get you settled. Mrs. Potts has drawn a bath for you, and she's found some clean clothes that should fit. You'll feel better after you've had a chance to freshen up." The luxury of a hot bath and clean clothes did indeed improve Grace's spirits. Mrs. Potts, despite her stern appearance, proved to be kind and attentive, even helping Grace wash her hair and providing a comb and hairpins to arrange it properly. By the time Flynn returned late that afternoon, Grace felt more like herself than she had in days. She was sitting in the doctor's small parlor, reading a book, when Flynn entered, accompanied by a tall man wearing a sheriff's badge. Flynn stopped short when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly before he collected himself. "Grace, this is Sheriff Collins, Sheriff Miss Grace Keating." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Madam, Flynn's been telling me about your ordeal. I'm mighty sorry about your home." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace replied. "Have you formulated a plan?" "We have," Flynn said. "The sheriff's gathered 6 men he trusts. We'll ride out at first light tomorrow to intercept Blackwell before he reaches town." "You believe he's coming here?" Grace asked, alarmed. "We know he is," the sheriff confirmed. "Got word from a rancher to the north that Blackwell and his remaining men were seen heading this way. They're tracking you, Miss Keating." Grace's hands tightened on the book she was holding. "Why not wait for them here? Set a trap." "Too risky," Flynn said. "Too many innocent people could get hurt. Better to meet them on open ground on our terms." The logic was sound, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over her. "Be careful," she said softly, her eyes on Flynn. "All of you." That evening, Dr. Samuelson hosted a simple but pleasant dinner for Flynn, Grace, and the sheriff. Despite the serious circumstances that had brought them together, the conversation was lively, with the men sharing stories of their adventures and Grace contributing tales of her own from her life on the farm. As the evening wore on, Grace found herself growing increasingly aware of Flynn's presence beside her at the table, the warmth of his arm when it occasionally brushed against hers, the rich sound of his laughter when the doctor recounted a particularly amusing anecdote, the way his eyes kept finding hers across the table. After dinner, the sheriff took his leave to make final preparations for the morning's departure. Dr. Samuelson, sensing that Flynn and Grace might want some privacy, made his excuses and retired to his study, leaving them alone in the parlor. A slightly awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. "You look different," Flynn finally said. "I mean, you look lovely." Grace touched her hair self-consciously. "Mrs. Potts had arranged it in a simple but elegant style with soft tendrils framing her face. The dress she'd been given was modest but far nicer than anything Grace had owned on the farm. "Thank you," she said. "Mrs. Potts was very kind." Flynn moved closer to her, his expression serious. "Grace, about tomorrow." "Please don't go," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "It's too dangerous. Let the sheriff and his men handle it." Flynn's eyes softened. "You know I can't do that." "Why not? You've done your duty. You've brought me to safety. Let someone else risk their life for once." "It's not that simple," Flynn said, running a hand through his hair. "Blackwell has to be stopped, and I have to be the one to stop him. For Sarah, for my nephew, for everyone he's hurt." "And what about James?" Grace asked. "What happens to him if you don't come back?" The question hit its mark. Flynn's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing his features for the first time since she'd met him. "I have to do this," he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Grace stepped closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "There's a difference between justice and vengeance, Flynn. Justice serves the living, vengeance serves the dead." Flynn's eyes held hers, a storm of emotions visible in their depths. "And what about you?" he asked softly. "What do you want?" "I want you to come back," Grace whispered. "I want you to live." Something broke in Flynn's expression then, a wall coming down that had been carefully constructed over years of solitude and duty. He reached for her, one hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Grace," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. She didn't know which of them moved first, but suddenly his mouth was on hers, and she was kissing him back with a fervor that surprised her. His arms encircled her, drawing her against the solid warmth of his chest, and she clung to him, her heart pounding with emotions she couldn't name. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I've never met anyone like you," he murmured. "In just 3 days, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I want." "And what do you want?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A future," Flynn said simply. "A home, James, and you, if you'd consider it." Grace's heart soared at his words, but fear quickly tempered her joy. "Then don't go tomorrow. We can leave, all of us, start somewhere new." Flynn shook his head, though the regret in his eyes was palpable. "Blackwell would find us. He doesn't give up." "The only way we can have that future is if I end this now." Grace knew he was right, but it didn't make the knowledge any easier to bear. "Then promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back." Flynn kissed her again, more gently this time. "I promise," he said against her lips. "I have too much to live for now." Morning came too quickly. Grace woke to the sound of men's voices downstairs and the clatter of horses in the street. She dressed hurriedly and made her way down to find Flynn and the sheriff going over their plans one last time. Flynn looked up when she entered, his eyes softening at the sight of her. "Grace." "I wanted to see you off," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The sheriff, sensing the tension between them, made a discreet exit to join his men outside. Flynn crossed the room to her, taking her hands in his. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said. "Doc will look after you until then." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Flynn leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of promises and possibilities and a future neither of them had imagined just days ago. "Be safe," she whispered when they parted. "Always," he replied with a small smile. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that made Grace's heart ache. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Grace tried to keep herself occupied, helping Mrs. Potts with household chores and assisting Dr. Samuelson with organizing his medical supplies, but her mind kept returning to Flynn and the danger he was facing. By late afternoon, her nerves were so frayed that she couldn't sit still. She took to pacing the doctor's front porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of returning riders. It was nearly sunset when she finally spotted a cloud of dust in the distance. Her heart leapt, then plummeted as she realized it was just 2 riders, not the 8 men who had ridden out that morning. As they drew closer, Grace could make out the sheriff and another man she didn't recognize. There was no sign of Flynn. Grace's legs gave out and she sank onto the porch steps, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. Dr. Samuelson, who had been watching with her, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't jump to conclusions," he advised. "Wait until we hear what happened." The sheriff dismounted wearily in front of the house, his face grim as he approached. "Where's Flynn?" Grace asked, rising to her feet. "Miss Keating," the sheriff began, removing his hat. "There was a shootout. Blackwell and his men were waiting for us in a canyon. They had the high ground." "Where is Flynn?" Grace repeated, her voice rising with panic. The sheriff looked at her with sympathy. "He went after Blackwell, told us to get back to town, that he'd handle it himself." "And you left him?" Grace demanded, anger cutting through her fear. "We didn't have much choice, madam. 2 of my men were badly wounded. We had to get them back for medical attention." Dr. Samuelson was already moving toward his office, calling for Mrs. Potts to prepare his surgical instruments. The second rider was helping the wounded men from their horses. Grace turned back to the sheriff. "Where did this happen? I need to go to him." "It's too dangerous," the sheriff protested. "Blackwell's still out there and so are his remaining men." "I don't care," Grace said fiercely. "I'm not leaving Flynn out there alone." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Grace's expression stopped him. "Canyon del Diablo," he finally said. "About 10 miles north of here, but I can't let you go alone." "Then come with me," Grace challenged. The sheriff sighed, looking torn. "I can't leave my wounded men and the rest of my posse is scattered, but—" He turned to the other rider. "Matthews, you up for another ride?" The man nodded grimly. "For the Marshal, absolutely." Within minutes, Grace was mounted on a fresh horse borrowed from the livery, with Matthews riding beside her. The sheriff had given them directions to the canyon where the shootout had occurred, along with a stern warning to be careful. "If you find him, bring him back," the sheriff said. "Don't try to be heroes. Blackwell's not worth dying for." Grace and Matthews rode hard, pushing their horses as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Grace's mind was filled with terrible images: Flynn wounded, Flynn dying alone in the desert, Flynn already dead. "He's a tough one, the Marshal," Matthews said as they rode, perhaps sensing her distress. "Been tracking outlaws longer than most. If anyone can survive this, it's him." Grace appreciated the attempt at comfort, but fear had taken root too deeply in her heart to be easily dislodged. They reached the canyon as night fully descended, the nearly full moon providing just enough light to navigate by. Matthews led them carefully along the canyon rim, searching for signs of the earlier confrontation. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a narrow trail that led down into the canyon. "That's where we came in this morning." They descended cautiously, Matthews with his rifle at the ready. The bottom of the canyon was eerily quiet, with only the occasional call of a night bird breaking the silence. "This is where it happened," Matthews said as they reached a wider area where the canyon split into 2 branches. "Blackwell and his men were up there." He pointed to a rocky ledge above them. "We were pinned down here. The Marshal, he went that way." He gestured toward the left fork of the canyon. Grace urged her horse forward, her eyes straining in the darkness for any sign of Flynn. Matthews followed close behind, his posture tense and alert. They hadn't gone far when Matthews suddenly raised his hand, signaling Grace to stop. "Listen," he whispered. At first, Grace heard nothing beyond the soft shifting of their horses' hooves on the sandy ground. Then a sound reached her, a low groan, barely audible, coming from somewhere ahead. "Flynn," she called out, unable to contain herself. Another groan, louder this time. Grace dismounted and rushed forward, Matthews close behind with a lantern now lit and held high. The light fell on a figure slumped against the canyon wall. Flynn, his shirt dark with blood, his face pale in the lantern light. "Flynn," Grace cried, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh God, Flynn!" His eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on her face. "Grace," he whispered. "You shouldn't be here." "SHH," she soothed, her hands already working to assess his injuries. He had a bullet wound in his left shoulder and another in his side. Both were still bleeding, though not heavily. "Blackwell," Flynn managed to say. "He got away, heading for the border." "I don't care about Blackwell," Grace said fiercely. "I care about you." Matthews had knelt on Flynn's other side, examining the wounds with a practiced eye. "We need to get him back to town, to the doctor," he said. "These need proper tending, but he'll live if we move quickly." Relief washed over Grace, so powerful it left her weak. "You hear that? You're going to be fine." Flynn's hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "You came for me," he said, wonder in his voice. "Of course I did," Grace replied, brushing hair from his forehead. "I love you." The words slipped out naturally, as though she'd been saying them all her life. Flynn's eyes widened, then softened with an emotion that made Grace's heart swell. "I love you too," he whispered. "Didn't realize how much until I thought I might never see you again." Getting Flynn back to town was a difficult process. Matthews fashioned a travois using branches and blankets, which they attached to Matthews' horse. The journey was slow and painful for Flynn, who drifted in and out of consciousness, but Grace rode beside him the entire way, holding his hand and speaking words of encouragement. They reached Silverdale just before dawn. Dr. Samuelson, who had been up all night tending to the wounded deputies, immediately set to work on Flynn's injuries. Grace refused to leave his side, assisting the doctor as he removed the bullets and stitched the wounds. "He's lost a good deal of blood," Dr. Samuelson told her when they'd finished. "But he's strong, and the bullets didn't hit anything vital. With proper care and rest, he should make a full recovery." Grace sank into a chair beside Flynn's bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her now that she knew he would live. She must have fallen asleep because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the window, and Flynn was watching her, his eyes clear and alert despite his pallor. "Good morning," he said softly. Grace straightened, wincing at the stiffness in her neck from sleeping in the chair. "Flynn, how do you feel?" "Like I've been shot twice," he replied with a wry smile, "but better than I have any right to." Grace moved to sit on the edge of the bed, taking his hand in hers. "You scared me half to death." "I'm sorry," Flynn said sincerely. "I didn't mean to break my promise." "You didn't," Grace pointed out. "You came back, just not quite under your own power." Flynn chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Blackwell got away," he said, his expression darkening. "He's still out there." "And he can stay out there," Grace said firmly. "You've done enough, Flynn, more than enough." Flynn studied her face, his eyes searching. "You meant what you said, in the canyon." Grace knew exactly what he was asking. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I love you, Flynn Garrett. It may have only been a few days, but I know what I feel." Flynn's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "I love you too, Grace Keating, more than I thought possible." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Samuelson entered, followed by the sheriff and a man in an expensive suit whom Grace didn't recognize. "Good to see you awake, Marshal," the sheriff said. "You gave us quite a scare." "Sorry about that," Flynn replied. "Who's your friend?" The man in the suit stepped forward. "Jonathan Whitfield, Mr. Garrett. I represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company." Grace tensed and Flynn's hand tightened around hers. "What does the railroad want with us?" Flynn asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I've been informed of the situation regarding Miss Keating's property and the unfortunate methods employed by certain parties to acquire it," Whitfield said. "I want to assure you that the railroad had no knowledge of Mr. Blackwell's involvement or tactics." "But you did want my land," Grace said. "Yes," Whitfield admitted. "Your property is indeed on our proposed route. However, we are prepared to offer you fair compensation well above market value should you be willing to sell." And if I'm not, Whitfield hesitated. The company would prefer to reach an amicable agreement, but we do have the option of pursuing an eminent domain claim. Which would take time, the sheriff interjected. Time during which Miss Keating would need somewhere to live and a means of support. Whitfield nodded. Indeed. Which is why I'm authorized to offer a substantial sum as an immediate good faith payment, regardless of the final outcome. Additionally, the company would be willing to provide alternative land of equal or greater value in another location. Grace looked at Flynn, uncertain how to proceed. His eyes held a question, and she nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak for her. Mr. Whitfield, Flynn said, his voice stronger than before. Miss Keating has been through a terrible ordeal because of your company's interests, whether directly sanctioned or not. Before she makes any decisions about her property, I think we need some time to discuss the matter privately. Whitfield looked like he wanted to object but thought better of it. Of course, I'll be in town for 3 days. Please let me know when you're ready to talk. He handed a card to the sheriff, nodded to Grace and Flynn, and left. The sheriff followed shortly after, and Dr. Samuelson, after checking Flynn's bandages, gave them the privacy they needed. What do you think? Grace asked once they were alone. Flynn shifted to a more comfortable position, wincing slightly. I think you have options now, more than you did a few days ago. That's not what I'm asking, Grace said. I'm asking what you think we should do. The emphasis on we wasn't lost on Flynn. His eyes softened as he looked at her. I think I want a future with you, Grace, whatever that looks like. If you want to fight for your land, I'll fight beside you. If you want to take the railroad's offer and start fresh somewhere else, I'll go with you. What about your ranch near Prescott? Grace asked. And James? Flynn's expression grew thoughtful. The ranch has been sitting mostly empty for years now. It could use a woman's touch, and James. He needs a family, a real one. Grace's heart swelled with hope. Are you asking me something, Marshal Garrett? Flynn smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. I'm not doing this properly. I should be on one knee with a ring and flowers and all the rest. But yes, Grace Keating, I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, helping me raise James, making a home with me, facing whatever comes next together. Tears filled Grace's eyes, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she said without hesitation, yes to all of it. Flynn pulled her down for a kiss, tender and full of promise. When they parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. I never expected to find you, he murmured. When I set out after Blackwell, I was only looking for vengeance. Instead, I found love. We found each other, Grace corrected gently, and now we'll never have to be afraid again. Never, Flynn agreed. Fear dies beside me, and love lives in its place. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Grace stood on the porch of Flynn's ranch, their ranch now watching as a wagon approached from the direction of town. Flynn stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his injuries healed enough that he moved with only the slightest hint of stiffness. The wagon carried Dr. Samuelson, who had traveled from Silverdale for the occasion, and a small boy with dark hair and solemn eyes, James, Flynn's nephew, now their son in all but name. As the wagon drew closer, the boy's expression changed from uncertainty to excitement when he spotted Flynn. By the time the wagon stopped in front of the house, James was practically bouncing with impatience. Flynn stepped forward, his face alight with joy as James leaped from the wagon and ran into his uncle's waiting arms. Flynn lifted the boy high, then set him down and knelt to look him in the eye. James, there's someone very special I want you to meet, Flynn said, holding out his hand to Grace. She stepped forward, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. This is Grace. She's going to be your new mother. James studied her with serious eyes that reminded her so much of Flynn. Did you marry Uncle Flynn? He asked directly. Grace smiled, kneeling down to be at his level. I did just last week. I hope that's all right with you. James considered this, then nodded solemnly. My mama said Uncle Flynn needed someone to look after him. Are you going to do that? I am, Grace promised, and I'm going to look after you too if you'll let me. A slow smile spread across James's face, and he suddenly threw his arms around Grace's neck in a fierce hug. "I'm glad you're here," he whispered. "Uncle Flynn smiles more when he looks at you." Grace's eyes met Flynn's over the boy's shoulder, and the love she saw there made her heart swell with happiness. They had faced danger together, found love in the most unexpected circumstances, and now they were building a family and a future neither of them had dared to hope for just months ago. The railroad had eventually reached a fair settlement with Grace for her land, providing enough money for them to expand the ranch and set aside funds for James's education. Flynn had resigned his position as a marshal, though he occasionally consulted with the territorial authorities on difficult cases. As for Blackwell, he had indeed fled to Mexico, but reports suggested he'd run afoul of local authorities there and met a violent end. Flynn had received the news with quiet satisfaction, but Grace had seen the weight lift from his shoulders, the burden of vengeance finally set down in favor of love and life. That night, after James had been tucked into bed in his new room, stories read and prayers said, Flynn and Grace stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. "Happy?" Flynn asked, his arms encircling her from behind. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "And you, I have everything I need right here," Flynn said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A home, a family, and a love I never expected to find." Grace turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "No more fear," she whispered. "No more fear," Flynn agreed, lowering his head to capture her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. "Only love, forever."